Hi, my name is Amy Bowie, and I'd like to start out by telling you a little bit about myself. My background is in special education. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst, or a BCBA. So, what's a behavior analyst? It means I'm supposed to know something about behavior. Science of behavior looks at studying why behavior occurs and how to use various strategies and principles to apply to change behavior, increase good behavior, decrease problem behavior, all of those kinds of things. And I've been working as a teacher for several years, then moved into a role of a consultant. I've been providing consultation to school districts and to families for many years. I opened a school for kids with autism. I primarily had been working with kids with autism with challenging behaviors, and that's always what I've loved to do. Just lots of classrooms of kids with significant behavior, and I felt like I was really making a difference with a lot of the kids that I was working with autism and some kids with developmental disabilities and Down syndrome, those kinds of things. And I've been doing that for many years. I really enjoyed it. Still do love working with kids with challenging behaviors. But something that changed everything that I thought I knew about behavior and how to work with kids and my background happened 19 years ago when I had my son, my oldest. And when we first started to see some behavior, if you will, out of him, it was more than the terrible twos. It was more than just the typical tantrum. Like he was having meltdowns. I would call them rage. They were just, really awful and upset and mad and angry and sad, and this combination of emotions that would last for hours, not just a few minutes. And I remember we had holes in our drywall. I mean, my son has never been aggressive towards me. He's never tried to hurt me or anybody in our family, but he tends to take it out on property. So he kicks things, he pounds things, he's broken a phone before. Scratches something in a piece of furniture. That's always, great to try to, keep your house looking good when you have a child that has destructive behavior. But, I know some kids are also aggressive towards people, and so they can respond in lots of different ways. But what that did is it just put me on this path of trying to figure out what in the world was going on, because my background was supposed to know something in behavior, and it didn't matter if I gave consequences. It didn't matter if I offered a trip to Disney World. Like nothing was changing. He was just having these meltdowns, and he was so riddled with what seemed like anxiety and fear, and he wasn't happy. He was not a happy child. Like I thought, gosh, kids are supposed to be happy. They're supposed to be having fun, and he just seemed miserable all the time. And I started to do everything that I could, going to the doctor, going to therapies, getting his IEP and school. And I kept thinking, everything was around the next corner was going to be the thing to fix everything. And he's been hospitalized several times for some aggressive behaviors towards things, just really upset, but mostly because a couple times he's felt like hurting himself. So we had to get his medicine right. And it's been hard. I mean, I know when I was younger and I saw a kid melting down in the grocery store, I judged them. I thought, well, it's probably because they just buy the candy when they act like that. And then all of a sudden it was my kid in the grocery store. It's my kid that's having all of these problem behaviors. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I just want to tell people I specialize in behavior somehow so they wouldn't judge me, because I knew they were. And you guys probably get that, like how many people, either your family or neighbors or whoever, says, well, you just haven't given enough consequences yet. And you and I both know the consequences make things a ton worse and don't seem to help. And, it just becomes very hard, because as a parent, you're supposed to be responsible for the discipline of your child's behavior. And when they're not having behavior, everybody's looking at you as if you're doing something wrong. And that was really hard for me. But the other thing that it did is, like, I thought, I'm going to figure this out. I don't know how. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to read everything I can. Went to workshops. I went to training, just everything I could possibly think of. And at the last hospitalization with my son, I came to the realization that I think maybe things were getting more significant, in that I was concerned about how severe the behavior was and whether he could still live with me. And that was really hard. And, just kind of got to the point where I've got to figure something out. I've got to figure out why this behavior stuff that's supposed to work is not really working. And my son just keeps having these meltdowns, if you want to call them. I know everybody's got different names for them, but I kind of prayed about it and read about stuff, and things kind of showed up. And I put together this program called Rage to Reason, and it's been phenomenal in how it's helped my son lots and lots of families, and we've been doing it a lot in the school districts. It's been really, really successful for a lot of kids. So I'm now getting to the point where I just want to share it with more families. I want to share it with more parents so that more kids can benefit, because I think there seems to be a lot of kids that, are diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder or other emotional disorder, and we're kind of struggling with what to do with them. So this has been very helpful, and I want to share this with families as a way of, I guess, kind of understanding the purpose behind why my son has struggled so much. That maybe me being a behavior analyst and my son having bipolar meant that together we could help other families, and that's what I'm trying to do. So you can read my story on my website. A lot of people kind of resonate with it as another parent, and I'm just very, very thankful, and to be able to provide this information for people. So this webinar, I'll kind of go through all of the things that you need to know to do Rage to Reason. What I always tell people is that Rage to Reason has a lot to do with kids that have refusals. I mean, that just seems to be a lot of what the concerns are with, whether it's oppositional defiant disorder or some of the newer diagnosis. It's refusals. I don't want to do what you're asking me to do. I don't like being told no. I don't want to follow directions, and all of those things become very challenging when you as the parent are the authority figure. So I always start with this quote: everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. And I always share this because a lot of times the way we evaluate how well kids are doing is how well they're doing in school. And my son's got a little bit of a learning disability. I mean, his best effort is going to be a C. He's graduated now, and he ended up doing well in school, although it was hard for him because of the anxiety. He had a hard time with friendships and peer relations and some of those kinds of things, but we made it through. And but if I just judged him on how well he did in school, I don't know, maybe some people would say a C wasn't that great. To me, I was very proud of that. But the other thing is, we really have to be thinking about how we describe our kids, and recognize the other strengths. I mean, I always tell people my son would never walk into the grocery store without making sure that he was holding the door for the person behind him, whereas my other two teenagers are on their phone all the time. They're not even paying attention. So my son is very intuitive, and thinks about other people, and very caring, very loving, loves animals, loves playing with little kids, is very relates to them very well. He's awesome. People say that all the time. When they're good and they're great. And when it's bad, it's really bad. And so, in a workshop or a training, webinar, whatever you want to call it, I always tell stories and like to kind of help illustrate some of those points. And so, I like for people to know that even though I might be sharing a story when my son was having a problem behavior, so I can make a point about a particular strategy or something that I want to talk about, is that he's an amazing kid. And our kids tend to be very intense and very passionate, and sometimes they channel that in a way that makes it kind of problematic. But if we can bring those things out in kids, it can be just phenomenal, the kinds of things that they can do. It's really cool. So understanding emotional disorders, lots of different types of emotional disorders. We have ODD, that tends to be very common, kind of general diagnosis for kids that are having some problem behavior. I think that was the diagnosis my son got when he was 3. We have conduct disorder, intermittent explosive, obsessive compulsive, the reactive attachment disorder, or RAD, I'm seeing more of. It's when kids don't make a connection or relationship with caregivers. Definitely anxiety, bipolar or mood disorders. Then there's the new one, which some of you may be hearing of the DMDD, or the disruptive mood dysregulated disorder. This was put in the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that outlines all the diagnosis. And many years ago, we were giving every child a bipolar diagnosis that was having some of these characteristics, and they found that they didn't maintain that diagnosis as an adult, so they put in this new mood disorder in the DSM-5. We can also see post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or even a dual diagnosis with autism and anxiety. Any of those things could fall under that category of emotional disorders. Now, you may be thinking, my child doesn't have a diagnosis. You don't need a diagnosis. If you think that there are some things that seem unusual for your child's age, I would definitely look at getting an evaluation. Just, now that my son is 19, he has bipolar, he has to be on medicine. I'm not saying every kid has to be on medicine, but it definitely has to be something that needs to be considered if there's a true mental illness or emotional disorder. emerging. I can't say I really don't want my child to be on medication because he has bipolar and he needs that to stabilize his mood. But, so there's reasons to go to the doctor and at least kind of look at that evaluation and rule some things out. Certainly, if your child's only 3, I wouldn't be wanting to put a diagnosis. You don't want a doctor that'll see you one time and already give you a label. But somebody that knows how to do a good evaluation would be, I think, very beneficial. But the main thing that we're concerned about is the behavior descriptions, right? It's the defiant, aggressive, angry, raging, resistant, willful, stubborn, non-compliant, and challenging. Those are the problems. And whether or not we want to put a label on it or not, sometimes by the time I see kids that are in middle school, doctors have given them 5, 10 different labels. Really, the concern is that kids are not following directions. They're refusing. They're not handling it when someone tells them no. They don't like it when things don't go their way, and oftentimes results in problem behavior, which again, for some can be just screaming and crying. Some can be that they hit. Some can be that they throw something. Some can be that they use profanity. Some of my kids in middle school shut down and try to sleep all day. So it could be any number of things, but it's the behavior descriptions that we're concerned about and what we want to do to change behavior. So here's a school example, but I need to kind of explain this to you so you understand how behavior works when we do something called an ABC analysis or an assessment. Maybe if your child is in special education, you recognize that people have talked about doing a functional behavior assessment or an FBA. But if you look here, we have the antecedent, which is always what happens before the behavior itself, and then the consequence. So looking at this example, the teacher presents work, and then the student has an aggressive tantrum, and because of that tantrum, they're sent to the office. Well, how does that work? What happens is when the teacher presents work and the tantrum gets them sent out of the office, what are they probably not doing in the office? The work that the teacher asked them to do. So in a way, this behavior of the tantrum that gets them sent out actually strengthens the behavior. It makes the aggressive tantrum stronger, and it makes them more likely to use it next time. So the next time the child comes in and someone asks them to do math, they're going to use the aggressive tantrum to get sent to the principal's office because it's working for them. It's working to make the demands go away. I have a high school student that I'm working with right now, and last year when she was in 8th grade, because she has an anxiety disorder, she would have problem behavior and they would call mom to pick her up. And mom said it was because they felt like her anxiety was more than she could handle. And I said, yeah, but she doesn't want to do her work. And every time she doesn't, she has this behavior. You come pick her up and then she gets to go home. Like, that's a learned behavior. That's something that's working for her. So, kids being picked up or sent home or any of those things, we have to recognize again that kids can learn 2 plus 2 is 4, or kids can learn that hitting gets me sent out of the room and I'm not doing the writing assignment. And so, we have to look at how that behavior is being learned and reinforced, because that's going to be important when we want to change behavior. If you look at this one down here, the teacher attends to another student, they use profanity, and then the teacher tells the student that there will be a consequence. So what does that look like? Maybe a child who's not getting any attention because the teacher's paying attention to someone else, and they say, "This is a bunch of crap," which, granted, I know some kids say worse than that, but that most likely is going to make the teacher come over and say, "Now, Joey, that's not okay to use those words in my classroom." Well, what did the child just do? No one was paying attention to them, and they got the teacher to come over to pay attention to them. So if behaviors for attention, like sometimes profanity or some of those kinds of things, or disruptive behavior, that can actually work to get attention. So again, this is a learned component here. And so, we have to kind of think about how those things work in a classroom and also at home. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that in the home setting, there are days where you're probably thinking, yep, I've done that before. I've asked my child to do something and they had a meltdown and I let it go. Because believe me, when you're at work and you're taking care of your kids and you've got laundry and everything else that you have going on in your life, sometimes you just can't handle one more meltdown. And I totally understand that. I'm not saying I'm not talking about whether you should or should not be doing that, but rather understanding how that reinforces your child's behavior. I always tell people there's a difference between something being right and wrong. I don't look at things being right or wrong, but rather effective and ineffective. So as another school example, when I was a kid, if I was in first grade and I wasn't paying attention in school and I started, talking to my friend, or I wasn't like getting my math done. And at the end of math, my teacher said, Amy, you didn't get your math finished and you talked to Cindy the whole time. So you need to stay in for recess and work on your math. I guarantee you that never would have happened again. Like that would have stopped my behavior. So that would be an effective strategy. When I first started teaching, I taught in a small town south of Springfield, and I started in January. They had opened up a new classroom because they had such an increase in the number of kids with learning disabilities. And I was literally given 12 kids to work with and was told that these 2 kids had lost their recess for the whole rest of the year. Now, I'm not so sure that was an effective strategy to change their behavior. So people may say, yeah, Amy doesn't like it when you take recess away. No, I don't like it when you take recess away and you have to keep taking it away, because that's not an effective strategy. I don't want to look at right and wrong. It's not that it's the right thing or the wrong thing. Is it effective? Is it changing behavior? Because if it's not, then I want to do something different. That's all. So I do the same thing when I'm talking to parents. You're not doing something wrong. The things that you do may work very well for some of your other kids, but that's not the concern. The concern is whether it's effective for your child. And if it's not, then we want to make those changes. So if we assume that it's all what I have on here, this escape avoid function, we assume that the behavior is working for them. In other words, the behavior, often explosive, works for demands to go away. Now, this was very interesting because in my background with behavior analysis, I knew that if a child had a tantrum and I let them get out of the demand, if you will, or they didn't have to do what I was asking them to do, that would reinforce it. I learned that in the classes that I took. So I felt like I was very consistent with my son. Like if he had a meltdown, it didn't matter. If he didn't want to brush his teeth, I picked him up and we went to brush his teeth. So this is where I started to question, that's not what's going on every time. Like it had nothing to do with the fact that I was giving in all the time. It could be, maybe some of the time, but some of the time it did not have to do with that. And that's what started making me think about what was going on with my son. If we just assume that it's learned, then we would say the child learns that arguing and tantrums are an effective means of coercing teachers and adults into giving in to his or her wishes or making demands disappear. So we would assume that this is just something, it's just a learned behavior. Just stop doing that and it won't happen anymore. But again, I felt like there was more to it. Now, this can be true for tantrums when we see this with the terrible twos. Like, right, everybody knows that the terrible twos happen. These kids have these little meltdowns. Some people will say, oh, the threes were even worse. But regardless, the terrible twos are a natural part of development that nobody really looks at as being something bad, but rather just something that you have to go through. So let me show you this video real quick of this little guy having his terrible two tantrum. Okay, don't you love how the dog knows what to do? That part just completely cracks me up. So funny. But we have this little guy and he doesn't like what just happened. And so in order for him to communicate that, he needs an audience. So if mom leaves, he goes and finds her. So one of the things I was thinking, like, I don't know what happened in this scenario, but let's say there was some candy sitting on the dining room table, and he goes over and he points to it and he wants some candy. And mom says, no, can't have any. We're getting ready to have dinner. Well, he's having this little tantrum because he would really like to have that candy. He doesn't like being told no. And so he's following mom around. He's crying, he's screaming. What would happen if after 10 more minutes of this, mom said, okay, you can have just one? What would happen? Well, that would strengthen that little tantrum, right? If I don't get what I want and I act like this, maybe eventually mom will give it to me. And so, that could be a learned behavior. But what's another thing going on with kids with some of these kinds of behaviors? There's a reason why 2-year-olds have tantrums, and part of it is because they have a skill deficit. The skill deficit has to do with the fact that they can't communicate well, they can't tolerate frustration, they don't know how to problem solve, they're not very flexible. And so some of this behavior is just part of development. It's that they don't have those skills yet. And what I would like to suggest is that some of the kids that we're working with that are still having some of these problem behaviors, that their level of emotional development and those kinds of things are at the same level of a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, only now it's happening in a 9-year-old body or a 12-year-old body. So the goal would be self-evident, right? Teach parents to be more consistent so as to help the child learn that his or her arguing and tantrums will not coerce adults into giving in or making demands go away, right? We just need to stop doing what we're doing by giving in all the time, and that will fix everything. Just like everybody's solution is to give more consequences, which we know doesn't always work. And so, again, this was hard for me because I thought, gosh, my background, I wasn't giving in all of the time. Like, that wasn't what was going on. So there had to be more to it, which is where I think some of those skill deficits came in. But what does it look like when we're trying to help with behavior? Is that we have a target behavior as compliance, right? We want our kids to listen to us and follow directions. So oftentimes the recommendations to determine a menu of rewards and punishments to give the child the incentive to comply with adult directions, and then develop a currency system like points, stickers, tokens, levels. And I don't know how many of you have tried those kinds of things. I've worked with parents that said, yes, I tried stickers and chore charts and all those kinds of things, and none of it worked, right? You could offer Disney World, and it just doesn't seem to be enough. So, what do we need to do? We have to ask, do these children have behavior because of poor parenting? In other words, is it as simple as us giving in or letting them get out of the demands that's causing the problem? Is it really our fault? And, I certainly would feel like people were looking at me all the time like I was doing something wrong or that this was going on, yet intuitively in my gut, I knew that wasn't the only piece. I knew that that wasn't the only thing that was going on. So one of the books that I would recommend reading is called The Explosive Child. Dr. Ross Greene is the author of that book, and a little bit of what he talks about more in his clinical role, something he calls the transactional or reciprocal model. And that is that the child's outcome is a function of the degree of fit or compatibility between the child and the adult. So in other words, a good level of compatibility between the child and the adult leads to a good outcome, and a decreased level of compatibility is a not so good outcome. But explosive behavior can be viewed as some of these manifestations of the adult-child incompatibility. So this will make sense when we get a little bit further down the line in talking about some of these things with the compatibility, because it's a really important component when we get to the part of helping to teach kids to regulate. So some of those incompatibilities could be child maltreatment, anxiety, depressed mood, social withdrawal, substance abuse. It moves away from fixing the problem child and fixing the problem adult into understanding some of these things. Now, you may be thinking, well, my child's not being maltreated, or there's no substance abuse. Maybe there was in the past, maybe there's not now, maybe there never was. There was no substance abuse in my household, but certainly the anxiety piece is something that we see a lot. And I would like to suggest that the kids that I am talking about and working with, and perhaps your child, because they don't regulate emotions well and are still functioning at that 2 and 3-year-old level, sometimes with their ability to handle frustration, don't do well with anxiety, stress, overwhelm, and fear. You can pick any one of those words, but handling stress and when things don't go the way that they thought they were, and changes and frustration and all of those things cause some problem behavior. And we need to kind of recognize how that works with our kids. So that means with this transactional perspective, the goal of treatment is to improve the compatibility between the child and the adult. And such a goal requires an understanding of characteristics of both the child and the adult and include them in treatment. So what does that mean? We need to understand why the behavior is occurring. Children do well if they can. This is Ross Greene's famous quote, if you will. And this makes a lot of sense to me. We talked about, people say when these kids are good, they're great. And if they're not, it's really bad. I get that. But most of the time, kids have this opportunity to, really be able to show that they can do a lot of great things. It's just when the anxiety or the bipolar or the mood disorder or the ODD or something comes out that becomes a problem. But I always ask people, when your kids are good, when you have that they're good, they're great moment, and you ask them, hey, Joey, is it okay when you're mad to use a bad word? What would they say? They'd say, no, absolutely not. It's not okay to do that. But yet we feel like we have to give a consequence for things so that they learn that that's not okay, yet they can communicate that they know it's not okay. And so we have to remember kids don't get up every day waiting to make our life miserable. If they could do better, they would. And what we want to do is to be able to really give them the tools to do that. So, what are some of these characteristics with kids? What I would like to suggest is that children have lagging skills in the area of flexibility, adaptability, frustration tolerance, and problem solving. But these are what 2-year-olds have trouble with, and that sometimes our kids at 9 and sometimes at 12 are still having trouble with being flexible, adapting to change, handling frustration, and problem solving when things come up. So compliance is defined as the capacity to defer or delay one's own goals in response to the imposed goals or standards of an authority figure, right? I have to stop what I'm doing, what my goals are, and do something that someone else wants me to do. And that is a very difficult skill, especially it can be considered one of many developmental expressions of the skills of flexibility, frustration tolerance, and problem solving. This can be extremely difficult for some of our kids. Yet everybody has to learn how to listen to an authority figure. Like even as an adult, I have to listen to my boss. I have to listen to, if I'm walking down the sidewalk and a police officer says, could you please step aside, ma'am? I'm not going to say why. I'm going to do it. I have to listen to an authority figure. And so our kids need to learn this skill. But you can see based on some of these skill deficits why compliance is so challenging for them. So parents can then understand that the child's difficulties are not due to a deficit in motivation, that we just don't have the right sticker chart in place, or adult ineptitude, we just keep giving in all the time and don't give enough consequences. But rather, some of it is this deficit in cognitive skills, that they actually have some trouble with some skill deficits. And I put this on there. In fact, we feel very compelled to give kids rewards and consequences so they learn that explosive behavior is not acceptable. And I believe they already know this. I've demonstrated this with many kids where, after they had some kind of a meltdown, I said, is it okay for you to say those words or do those things? Oh, no, it's not okay. And they absolutely know that. It's demonstrating it in the moment that becomes very difficult for them. So that starts with one of the main areas of deficits that I want to talk about, which are these deficits in what we call executive function skills. So the definition, the executive functions are a set of processes that have to do with managing oneself and one's resources in order to achieve a goal. And it's the umbrella term for their neurologically based skills involving mental control and self-regulation. So what in the world does that mean? The executive functions, we think in pictures and words and plan and problem solve. We think of things like hindsight and foresight. So the way that I like to describe it is that between a thought and an action, there should be some space. And in that space, we think in our minds in pictures and words, and we think about things like, do I have everything I need to do this action? If I don't have everything I need to do this action, can I get it? What's the rule for following this action? What happened the last time I did something similar? And what might happen this time if I do this action? And all of those things happen in our minds. Sometimes our kids that don't have good executive function skills, they are impulsive. They don't have that space. They act, they think, and they act. And a really good example, I had this child that they asked me to come do a consultation for. And the principal and teacher were so frustrated. They were like, he knows all the rules. He tells us all the rules. He knows exactly what he's supposed to do, and he just won't do it. And they were very frustrated. So they said, we do check in and check out. We go over the rules in the morning. We go over the rules in the evening, afternoon. He knows exactly what he's supposed to do. So I'm watching his class. His entire class is transitioning down the hallway and walking to the computer lab. And I notice as they get to the computer lab, it's about 3 steps down to get to the room where the computer lab was. And so here's Joey walking with his class, and what do you think happens? He gets to the top of the stairs and then takes a flying leap down to the bottom, jumping over 3 stairs. And the teacher stops him and says, Joey, we've talked about this. How do you walk into the computer lab? And he's like, oh, I'm supposed to walk. Do we jump? No, we're not supposed to jump. And so she looks at me like, see, I told you, he knows what the rules are, but he's choosing not to follow them. And I thought, well, I really see some executive function skill deficit. In other words, he walks to the top of the steps and he doesn't stop and have that space and say, here's some steps. They look fun to jump off of, but wait, what's the rule? What happened the last time I did not follow the rule? That's right, I lost my recess, so I better walk down these steps. There's no space. It's steps, looks like fun, jump. Oh, yeah, that's right. There was something I was supposed to do about that. So that lack of executive function skill can sometimes cause behaviors that, again, are a skill deficit, not because someone is purposely saying, you know what, I don't care what the rule is about the steps, I'm going to jump anyway. It's also, thinking in pictures and words. Our middle school kids are not standing at their locker saying, you know what, I have world history and algebra next. They are nowhere near my locker. So I will have to be prepared for both of those classes. What all do I need? Pencils and notebooks and books? No, they show up to class without even a pencil. And I guarantee you, most of the time, it's not because they're standing at their locker saying, you know what, I don't like Mr. Smith and I'll be darned if I bring him a pencil. No, it's that they just don't think about it because of that lack of executive function skills. So another thing that I usually give as an example, it's kind of a silly example, but like let's say you're listening to this webinar and you're also kind of multitasking, trying to do a couple of other things, but you think to yourself, you know what, I really need to figure out what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. And so maybe you have a thought that it might be good to fix meatloaf. Your family really likes meatloaf and you haven't had that for a while. So the next couple of thoughts in your mind have to do with, do I have everything I need to make meatloaf? And you're thinking through what your recipe calls for, and you have a thought that, oh, I know it calls for ketchup, and I remember we used the last of it last Saturday. So your next thought is, if you still want to have meatloaf, you have to buy ketchup. So now you're going to go to your mind and think about your schedule. I got to pick up the kids at a certain time. We have soccer practice, we have piano lessons. And then maybe you get to the point you're like, oh my gosh, my day is so busy. There's no way I have time to run to the store. And so I'm not going to be able to get any ketchup. So I guess I'll have to think of something else to make. And you have to handle the fact that that might be frustrating if meatloaf was the only thing that sounded good. Now, think about how long it took me to say all of that versus how long it actually happens in your mind. And we do that very quickly, and you can pay attention to this at the same time. That's your executive function skills working. And so, it's kind of a silly example, but when our kids are missing some of these skills, that can be very challenging. So the executive functions is a producing difficulty, not a learning difficulty. It has to do with actually being able to do the skill, not know the skill. And I had a kid, we just finished his IQ testing. He has 113 IQ, which is above average, but he has significant executive function skill deficits. It is a function of the frontal lobe, that's the front part of the brain. I always tell people, like, the back of the brain is the primitive part of the brain, the first part of the brain that was developed. It's where people kind of get into fight, flight, or freeze, and we're very reactive, all the way up to the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe. And that's where people are really thinking more in those executive function skills and planning and problem solving. We also know there's other parts of the brain involved in executive functions, like short-term memory and some of those kinds of things. But that's, a lot of where those skills develop. And it does develop throughout a person's lifetime into the second decade of life. You may remember some time when you did something rather impulsive and dumb in your 20s that you may not do now. That's because your executive functions were not quite all the way developed. It does wire and route how we think and function, and it impacts reading and writing. I think almost all of the kids I work with, writing seems to be a trigger. And it's not about learning a new skill, but demonstrating the skill that the executive functions are apparent. So being able to demonstrate that. So there's 8 executive function skills. I want to go over them and kind of explain to you how each one can be a deficit, but how it sometimes looks like a behavior. And I'll be giving you some examples of that. So the first one has to do with inhibit. And I put in parentheses because I use this for school as well. Like, these are the kids that the teacher says, oh yeah, this is my class clown in the classroom. And this is the ability to stop one's own behavior. So, these kids act wilder in groups than others. They don't stop laughing when other kids stop laughing. They hum, they make noises, just can't stop or inhibit their own behavior. And an example of this was when my kids were young, and my son was probably 6 or 7 years old. And we lived in a subdivision where we were on a cul-de-sac. And the, like basically when the neighbors, when it was nice out, the neighbors would sit outside and we'd sit in chairs and hang out and the kids could just play, right? We're on a cul-de-sac so they could play kickball and ride bikes and do different kinds of things. And that was always, fun for the kids. But I would sit there in the chair next to my friends and neighbors, and I would sit there with that feeling in the pit of my stomach because I knew it was going to happen because it always happened. And sure enough, something would happen. But before that, kind of understanding like there happened to be a lot of other boys all that age, that 6, 7 year old age, I don't know, 4 or 5 boys all that age. And how do boys play? Boys play very rough and they wrestle and they roll down hills and they make sticks into machine guns and, they do all kinds of active kinds of stuff. And what would happen is someone would come and say that, my son had pushed somebody. And what I knew was going on was that, he would be in that kind of a setting and he would be playing and wrestling and then he would take it one step too far. Well, that's very different than someone saying, I don't like you and pushing them down. But that's how all the neighbors perceived it. That's how everybody perceived it. But that was not the same as this inability to inhibit or stop one's own behavior. So these kids have trouble at recess and PE and outside playing with the neighbors and all of those unstructured settings where they tend to take it one step too far. And again, that is different than intentionally being not nice to someone. The next one has to do with shifting, and this is to move freely as a circumstance demands or changes from one thing to another. So being able to shift, and this is especially hard, shifting from preferred activities. So this means you have to stop doing the video game, you have to get off the computer, you have to get off the tablet or the iPad, you have to turn the TV off, anything that has to do with shifting from one thing to the next. But something I kind of learned in a classroom setting, I had a student, and we were using the iPad as a reinforcer for him. He had it, I think, once or twice a day in the beginning or whatever. But man, we were just having major, major meltdowns every time he had to turn it off. And it was almost like, do we even use this? Because he's having such problems with turning it off. So my background being in autism, and I had worked with kids with autism, I thought, oh, I'll get a timer. A timer will be very helpful because it'll like predict for him when he has to get off. And so I'd set the timer and the timer would go off and he'd still have problems over turning it off. And, I'm trying to be proactive and predicting, you have 5 more minutes and then the timer goes off and he's still having trouble. It occurs to me as I'm reading some of these things, shifting is actually something that we all are able to do, but we have this little skill that we use where we get to a stopping point before we shift. So I started thinking about it, and you think about the games that kids might do on an iPad or a computer or a video game or something like that. And typically they're goal oriented, right? You're trying to get to a certain level, or a knight is trying to defeat a dragon. So we've got this goal oriented, and trying to stop in the middle of meeting that goal is very, very challenging. So this is an example I give. Like, let's say you're on your online banking and you're trying to figure out how much money you've spent on gas over the last 3 months. So you've got a piece of paper, you've kind of, writing down all your numbers here, and you get your calculator out app on your phone and you start adding them up, and you've got the first 3 added, and then your child or husband, wife, somebody comes in and says, hey, I need you for something. Are you going to shift right there? Or are you going to say, just a minute, finish adding up the 10 or 12 numbers, write down your answer, and then shift? So when I realized that what I was doing with this particular student in this classroom was that I was asking him to shift in the middle of something, and that was very challenging for him. So we just changed it. We made sure we had a little bit more time. We said, okay, when the timer goes off, you have to get to the next stopping point. Now, what do you think happened when he got to the next stopping point at first? He would start over again. So we had to work with him to reinforce that when you get to a stopping point and that's when you turn it off, then that's going to be reinforced. And that really helped with all of our kids being able to shift, because we want to use these things as reinforcers, but if it causes such a problem to have to turn them off, then you get to the point where you feel like, is this even worth it? The other one is emotional control, or these meltdowns, the ability to regulate emotions. So this is where our kids, like, minor things become a big deal. it just kind of depends. I had this little guy, Joey, we'll say his name is Joey. He gets off the bus and he starts to walk to his class, and his friend, we'll say Tommy, gets off after him. And Tommy walks very quickly past him and gets into the classroom, and Joey's just completely upset. He went into the classroom first. It was my turn to go into the classroom first. I want to punch him in the face. It's not fair. I get to go in first. Just this absolute meltdown over not being able to go into the classroom first. So what was a minor thing to him was a really, really big deal. And that's what we see in a lot of our kids, that it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, but to them, it becomes a major deal. The next one is to initiate. These are kids that we say, oh gosh, they're just kind of lazy. Not that I would ever call a kid lazy, but just challenging people to think about whether or not we categorize kids this way. But this is to begin a task or generate an idea. So in a school setting, this is always the kids, we say it's time to write in your journal, and they say, I don't know what to write about. Well, they may not know what to write about because they can't generate that idea or getting started on something. My kids that I work with, have a really hard time. Like, how do you organize and where do you start and what do you need, and all of those different kinds of things can be difficult for kids to get started. So here's my test for you. If you have a child that once they get started, they're fine, like they refuse to take a shower because they don't want to shift from what they're doing to taking a shower, which is not preferred, but then once they're actually in the shower, they're fine, then that could be an issue of not being able to initiate, which is very different than a refusal. The other thing to know is that for everybody, whether you have executive function skill deficits or not, everybody under stress and anxiety, your executive function skills don't work as well, period. The way that we put it is that the anxiety hijacks the frontal lobe. Those executive function skills don't work. And that's in you, me, adults, children, everybody, whether or not you have deficits or not. So I get this sometimes in a school setting where teachers will say, well, he's refusing to do his math. He did it last week. I know he knows how to do it, but he's refusing. Yet you don't know what level of anxiety and stress that child is experiencing right now and whether or not they can use those executive function skills. I mean, maybe somebody on the playground made fun of their middle name and they're still feeling upset about that. They're not going to be ready to come in and do math. I mean, I've had some kids that I've worked with that, their background prior to the environment that they're in at the time was not good, and maybe there was some abuse or emotional abuse. One family that or one little guy that I worked with was single mom, and his brother, and she had a heroin addiction, and so we were still trying to kind of help get her some help. But this little guy said, I don't know, sometimes my mom doesn't come home and sometimes she does, but I can't wake her up. And I have to get up at 6:30 so that my brother, who's in kindergarten, and myself can get on the bus at 7, because at least that way we get to eat twice, breakfast and lunch. Well, how ready is this kid to come in and do math? He's got a lot of things going on. So thinking about initiating, beginning a task, regulating emotions, all of those things, they don't work as well under stress. And you can probably understand that, like when you've had a day that was just stressful and work was hard and you've got things going on at home and your kid comes in and says, Mom, and you say, just a minute. You don't normally say that, but during those situations, your executive function skills and impulse and those kinds of things are not working very well. The example I like to give with the initiate is, let's say you've had one of those days, like you're just dead tired because of how long of a day you've had and how long work has been. And maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're not, but your kids were driving you crazy, and you get home and your kids were driving you crazy, or whatever. Everybody's had those days where it's just been very challenging. And let's say it's about 10:30 at night. You decide, I'm kind of done for the night. You put your comfy clothes on, you go sit on the couch. Maybe you've got your tablet out, or you've got the remote, getting ready to watch TV. Those kinds of things, just basically ready to kind of crash for the night. Then all of a sudden, as you're already comfy on the couch, maybe under a blanket, looking at your iPad, and you suddenly think to yourself, oh, I really need to do a load of laundry. Like, how hard is it to initiate and get up and do a load of laundry in that moment? Like, most people would think, okay, do I have enough underwear to get through one more day, right? That's just what you're going to do. So that initiation is hard. I try to give that example that for kids with executive function deficits, everything that you're asking them to do that's not necessarily a preferred activity and shifting from something preferred feels like that to them. And again, the clue is whether or not once they're doing it, they're fine. Then that possibly could be a skill deficit as opposed to just an outright refusal. Okay, a couple of others is working memory, and that's holding information in mind for a task. So these are kids, we say, how many times do I have to tell you? Well, we have to tell them a lot of times because they don't hold that information in mind. They don't hold the information in mind for what they need in order to plan and problem solve and have all the materials that they need. And so they can be very forgetful and not remember things well. And so that can be an executive function deficit. The next one on there is to monitor or being clueless, the self-regulation. So this is how kids recognize how their behavior affects others. Like at some point, I don't know, by second or third grade, kids that are upset are not going to lay on the floor and start kicking their feet because they would notice that their friends would look at them and think that was weird behavior. So they have that social awareness and how their behavior affects others. Sometimes our kids don't have that. Kind of a funny story. I had this student, Tim, and I had him in third, fourth, and fifth grade. And in fifth grade, towards I don't know, the end of the second semester, he starts this new behavior, which he's like putting his hands in his armpits and smelling his fingers. And, everybody's like, gross, Tim is smelling his armpits. That's so gross. And so I had him come in my classroom. It was just the two of us. I knew this probably wasn't going to happen at home. So I bought him some deodorant. I said, okay, you need to start using deodorant. Deodorant is something that, your body's changing. He's like, how do I know that stuff will work? I was like, well, this product's been around a while. So if it wasn't around for a while, if it didn't work, people wouldn't buy it anymore. And trying to kind of convince him, talk him into it kind of thing. He wasn't having it. He's like, I don't know if that stuff will work. So then finally I'm like, okay, I want you to try it. And if you don't think it's working, you can maybe go check in the bathroom a couple times just to make sure. But I'm pretty sure this is really going to work for you. And he kind of stopped and he's like, does that mean you go in the bathroom every day and smell your armpits, Mrs. Bowie? And I said, no, I don't, because my deodorant works good, which is what I'm trying to convince you of. But Tim, it's a very good point, because if for some reason I thought that my deodorant was not working, I would check it in the bathroom privately, not in the middle of social studies class. I said, Tim, this is why the kids don't want to sit by you at lunch. He's like, really? Like, yes. So not being aware of how his behavior affects others. Another one is to plan and organize, the ability to manage a task demand, what you need to do, like how much you need to have finished by a certain point for something to be due in 2 weeks, and then organizing materials, collecting and storing. So these are kids are messy desk, messy backpack, messy room, can't find anything, loses glasses, loses lunch money, really has an inability to keep things organized. And organization needs to be taught. Sometimes you and I, as the parents, are not very organized, or maybe that's just not a skill, but actually having time to practice and work on those skills, even in a classroom setting. Like sometimes I'll tell the teachers, these kids don't do good to have a green notebook and a green folder for reading, and a yellow notebook and a yellow folder for science, and like all these notebooks and all these folders. That can just be too much for some of our kids. And giving them those skills to be able to know how much needs to be done at a certain point and how to organize and those kinds of things can be very specific skills that need to be taught. So of the executive function skills, these 8 are very important for kids to be able to function. Here's all the examples that we went over. Trouble stopping when silly or acting wilder in groups, not transitioning well from preferred activities, maybe overreacting to small things and being moody, these explosive, angry outbursts. They need to be prompted to begin a task and easily distracted, forgetful, maybe not asking help even when they need it, unaware of how their behavior affects others, and they're unorganized and lose everything. So these are all of the things that we see. Now, it's interesting that many years ago there was a study at Stanford called I don't remember the name of the study. I always call it the marshmallow study, but 3 and 4-year-olds were given a marshmallow and said, here's a marshmallow. You can eat it now, or if you wait 5 minutes, you can have a second marshmallow. So it would be good to wait, right? Because then you get 2 of them. And so they videotaped these little 3-year-olds, like some of them, would like sit on their hands and cover their eyes and, different things that they were doing. And they found in the study about a third of the kids were able to wait for the second marshmallow. That would be an executive function skill, being able to inhibit, of being able to stop your behavior, especially for a better reward later. They followed these kids until after high school, graduating from college, in their work life, their family life. And these one-third children had better ACT scores and SAT scores and better jobs and higher paying jobs and higher socioeconomic status. So they found that this is a skill that's really, really necessary for success in life. So does that mean a third of the kids are lucky and two-thirds are not? Know what it means. It needs to be specifically taught. So if your child is having trouble with executive function skills and you can kind of understand some of these things need to be taught. There's books. Seems like I've been seeing some new stuff at Borders. Definitely something you should ask to be in the IEP or the 504 plan, or in the school curriculum, to be able to work on these skills, because it's going to be very, very important in order to have all of this as part of the educational plan, because kids that don't have these skills will definitely struggle in life, in college, and jobs, and those kinds of things. All of these things are really, really necessary to be successful in those areas. And if kids don't have the skills and someone's just doing it for them, or and not teaching those skills, or they're not modifying and accommodating things enough, kids will either associate school with failure or they'll become too prompt dependent. And either way, they're not going to be successful. So this is a very, very key component to providing part of the educational components in a curriculum for kids.